Sounding like this is Summer from Yanzus, and today we will discuss about the skull. So basically, following bones are involved in skull formation. If we see in front view, frontal bone, nasal bone, lacrimal bone, zygomatic bone, maxillary bone, vomer, mandible, inferior nasal concha, ethmoid bone, temporal bone, sphenoid bone, and parietal bone. And so move towards the front view of skull. If you see in front towards the skull, this is the frontal bone. This blue color is known as frontal bone. Okay. So here in the middle, almost from above spear to nose, there is a prominence known as glabella, and around if we see in orbital fora, here in orbits, you see a notch here at the upper border of the orbits. This is supraorbital notch, supraorbital foramen, and this is orbital surface. This blue inside you see is orbital surface. Okay. If we see at the sides of frontal bone, this green color bone is known as parietal bone, and the suture between the parietal and the frontal bone is known as coronal suture. If we move towards nose, here this junction between the frontal bone and the nasal bones is known as nasion. Okay, now move towards this orange color. This is known as nasal bone, and this purplish surface you see is lacrimal bone. Then this orange colored bone is known as zygomatic bone. Here this is frontal process of zygomatic bone, and inside the orbit this zygomatic bone is going on, and this is known as orbital surface of zygomatic bone. Laterally this part is known as temporal process of zygomatic bone, and the foramen you see in zygomatic bone is known as zygomaticofacial foramen. This green colored bone you see is known as maxillary bone. Here near the zygomatic bone there is a zygomatic process of maxillary bone, and this maxillary bone is also running in the orbit. So here this is orbital surface of maxillary bone, and the foramen you see here is known as infraorbital foramen, as this is located below the orbit, so this is known as infraorbital foramen. And this surface of maxillary bone is near the frontal bone, so this is known as frontal process of maxillary bone. Then above the teeth there is alveolar process, and near the nose and below the nose here this is known as anterior nasal spine. This is all about maxillary bone. Zygomatic process, orbital surface, infraorbital foramen, frontal process, alveolar process, anterior nasal spine. Anterior nasal spine below the nose, alveolar process above the teeth, frontal process near the frontal bone, lateral to nose, or infraorbital foramen, as this foramen is located below the orbit, so this is known as infraorbital foramen. And orbital surface of maxillary bone, as this is running in the orbit, and zygomatic process, as this is near the zygomatic bone. Okay, this jaw you see is known as mandible. This grey colored bone is known as mandible. So mandible has other parts, like this is known as ramus of mandible, this part is known as body of mandible, and this foramen you see in the mandible is known as mental foramen. And the in the chin sometimes you see a dimple in many people, so this is known as mental protuberance, and around that dimple you see mental tubercle. Okay, so here we talk about mandible ramus, body, mental foramen, mental tubercle, and between the mental tubercles is a mental protuberance. Okay, this pinkish inside the nose is known as vomer. This is vomer bone. Okay, and inside the nose here you see these processes. So these are nasal concha, and this is inferior nasal concha. this is medial nasal concha. Okay, so now we talk about ethmoid bone. This is orbital plate of ethmoid bone. Inside the orbit you see this light bluish thing lateral to this pinkish bone. This is orbital plate of ethmoid bone. This is inside the nose is known as perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone, and this is middle nasal concha, as I have already told you. So this is ethmoid bone. Okay, this reddish you see here lateral to frontal bone or lateral surface of our skull is known as temporal bone. So now talk about sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone, this yellowish bone you see inside the orbit is known as sphenoid bone. This is lesser wing of sphenoid bone. This is greater wing of sphenoid bone, and also this is running here. This is also greater wing of sphenoid bone. This and this greater wing of sphenoid bone, and this is lesser wing of sphenoid bone. So this is all about the frontal view of the skull.